The dust of the Rio Pinon territory had a taste. It was the taste of grit, of sun-baked earth, and of endings. Lark Mercer tasted it on her lips, felt it in her throat, and saw it as a fine, reddish film coating the stagecoach window. For 3 days. It had been her constant companion, a shroud over a landscape of jagged mesas and skeletal sagebrush that offered no comfort, only a stark, brutal honesty. Late autumn of 1888 had bled the last of the green from the land, leaving behind a world of brown, ochre, and rust under a vast, indifferent blue sky. Lark clutched the cheap canvas bag on her lap, her knuckles white. Inside, nestled between her only spare dress and a worn copy of Sonnets, was the letter. It was the reason she had endured the bone-jarring journey, the leering eyes of men at lonely way stations, and the gnawing uncertainty that was a far worse travel companion than the dust. The letter was a promise of peace, and in her 24 years, peace was a currency she had never been able to afford. The stagecoach lurched, its iron-rimmed wheels groaning as they found the rutted track leading into Sagebrush Ferry. The town announced itself not with a welcome, but with a sound that clawed at the quiet, the dissonant clang of a chapel bell. Its call to piety immediately challenged by the raucous laughter of young men loitering near the livery. It was a town of contradictions, of prayer and predation existing side by side, a microcosm of the entire frontier. Through the dusty glass, Lark saw false-fronted buildings leaning against one another for support, their painted signs faded and peeling like sunburnt skin. Women in bonnets hurried along the boardwalk, their gazes fixed forward, deliberately ignoring the cluster of youths whose idleness felt like a threat. Lark's fingers sought the folded paper in her bag, tracing its crisp edges as if for reassurance. The letter was signed in a steady, unadorned hand by a man named Silas Crowell. He had written with a frankness that had felt like a clean, cool wind after years of stifling air. He was a widower. He'd explained, a rancher. He needed someone to care for his 4-year-old niece, whose parents had been taken by the fever that spring. He offered a fair wage, a solid roof, and, most importantly, a purpose. There was a quiet dignity in his words, a stoicism that resonated with the weary parts of Lark's own soul. For the first time since her own family had been scattered by tragedy and destitution, the letter made her feel like she had value beyond what a man might take from her. It made her feel needed. The steady script promised a steady life. The stagecoach pulled to a halt in a cloud of its own making. The driver shouting down, "Arrow and Cloud Ranch, end of the line for you, miss." Lark stepped down, her legs unsteady. The dust immediately settled on her dark skirt. She paid the driver, her hands trembling slightly as she counted out the coins. Then the coach was gone, rumbling away toward some other destination, leaving her utterly alone in the silence. She stood before a sagging wooden gate, the name of the ranch carved into the overhead arch, the letters weathered and faint. There were no welcoming banners, no flowers in a window box, not even a wisp of smoke from the chimney of the small, sturdy-looking house set back from the road. There was only a fence, its posts worn smooth and silver by wind and time, and a large barn stained the color of dried blood by the clay-rich soil. The place felt less like a home and more like a fortress, built to withstand a siege. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it, the start of the peace she had been promised. Taking a deep breath that was mostly dust, she pushed open the gate. It whined on its hinges, a lonely, metallic sound that seemed to hang in the air. As she approached, the great door of the barn slid open with a low rumble. A man emerged, stepping from the shadows into the harsh afternoon light. He was tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the sky. A thick, dark beard covered the lower half of his face, peppered with the same red dust that coated everything else. He wore a simple flannel shirt, its sleeves rolled to his elbows, and dungarees faded from work and sun. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a startlingly clear gray, the color of a winter storm, and they watched her with a caution so profound it was almost a physical barrier. His stance was still, his feet planted as if he'd grown from the earth, a man accustomed to silence and solitude. This had to be Silas Crowell. Lark's prepared greeting died on her lips. She felt small and out of place, a fragile bird that had landed in a hawk's territory. She cleared her throat, the sound ridiculously loud. "Mr. Crowell, I'm Lark Mercer." The man gave a slow, deliberate nod. He took a step toward her, his boots making no sound on the packed earth. He lifted a hand, not to shake hers, but to his own throat. He tapped it twice with his forefinger, a gesture sharp and final, and then shook his head slowly. A flicker of confusion, then alarm, went through Lark. Before she could process it, he reached to a leather belt at his side. From it hung a small slate board and a piece of chalk on a string, with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice. He unhooked it and wrote, the chalk scratching softly. He held the slate up for her to read. 2 words, stark and black against the gray. "I cannot speak." The air left Lark's lungs in a rush. A mute. The letter, the words had been so clear, so articulate. They had painted a picture of a thoughtful, quiet man. Yes, but not one who was silenced. A cold knot of dread began to form in her stomach. This was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. Before the weight of that realization could fully settle, the door of the small ranch house burst open. A child, a tiny girl with a wild tangle of brown hair and a smudged face, came running out onto the porch. She clutched a doll made of scraps of calico, its button eyes staring blankly. She couldn't have been more than 4. She stopped short on the top step, her own wide, solemn eyes fixing on Lark. For a moment, she was utterly still, a miniature statue of loss. Then, a single, hopeful word, fragile as a whisper, floated across the yard. "Mama." It was the instinctive, hollow cry of a child who had called that name into an empty room too many times. It wasn't a question for Lark specifically, but for any woman who might appear to fill the devastating void left behind. The sound of it, so pure in its desperate hope, struck Lark with the force of a physical blow. And then, another sound shattered the tableau. It came from the low rise of a hill overlooking the ranch, a cascade of jeering laughter, sharp and cruel. Lark's head snapped up. 5 young men on horseback were silhouetted against the setting sun. Watching the scene in the yard with undisguised amusement, they were flushed with the arrogance of youth and cheap whiskey. The one in the lead, a handsome man with a mean twist to his lips, swept an elaborate, mocking bow from his saddle. "Well, well, boys, look what the stage brought in," he crowed, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "The bride has arrived for our silent Silas." His companions erupted in fresh peals of laughter and crude whistles. One of them, a lanky youth with a vacant grin, shouted, "Hope you like quiet nights. Ma'am, he ain't much for conversation." The cold knot in Lark's stomach turned to ice, then to a burning, sickening heat that spread through her entire body. The letter, the steady hand, the promise of a quiet life. It all crashed down on her with the force of an avalanche. It was a joke, a cruel, vicious, frontier joke played on a lonely man and a desperate woman. The canvas bag slipped from her grasp, landing with a soft thud in the dust. The letter, which had fallen out, lay stark white against the red earth. She stared at it, the neat, tidy script now seeming to mock her, to laugh at her pathetic hope. The shame was a physical thing, a branding iron pressed against her cheek. It was hotter than the sun, sharper than the wind. She was a fool, a mail-order punchline delivered for the entertainment of bored, cruel men. Her first instinct was to run, to turn and flee back down the dusty track, to anywhere but here. She bent down, her movement stiff and jerky, and snatched the letter from the ground, her fingers crumpling the paper that had been her salvation. The laughter from the hill continued, a relentless, grating sound that scraped at her nerves. She straightened up, ready to turn, ready to face the long, humiliating walk back to a town that had already judged her. But as she did, a small sound from the porch stopped her. The little girl, Wren, was crying, not loud, wailing sobs, but the quiet, hopeless tears of a child who had just seen her last fragile hope evaporate. Her tiny hand was clenched on the porch railing, her other hand still clutching the rag doll. She looked from the laughing men on the hill to Lark's stricken face, and in her child's mind, she understood. She understood that this woman, this potential comfort, was about to leave. Her small voice, thick with tears, cut through the mockery. "Please, stay!" 2 simple words. They were not a demand, but a plea from the very bottom of a child's broken heart. They drilled a hole straight through the defensive wall Lark had thrown up around herself. In that moment, the jeers from the hill faded to a distant buzz. All she could see was the small, trembling girl on the porch. All she could hear was that desperate whisper. Silas had not moved. He stood like a monolith of stone, his face unreadable, his gray eyes fixed on the men on the hill. He had weathered their taunts, his expression unchanging, as if he were used to it. But when he heard his niece's plea, something shifted in his stillness. He turned his gaze from the riders to Lark. He looked at her crumpled dress, the tear tracking a clean path through the dust on her cheek, the crushed letter in her hand. He saw the shame and the fury and the despair warring in her eyes. Slowly, deliberately, he moved toward her. He shrugged out of the heavy brown canvas coat he wore. The air was growing cooler as the sun dipped lower, and the gesture was practical. Yet it felt like something more. He didn't speak. He couldn't. But as he gently, carefully draped the coat over her trembling shoulders, his actions spoke with more eloquence than any words could. The coat was heavy. It smelled of pine smoke, of horse leather, and of the clean, sharp scent of the cold night air. It was an anchor in the dizzying storm of her humiliation. It was a shield. The warmth of his body still clung to the fabric, a silent, powerful comfort. He didn't touch her further, just let the coat settle around her. His storm-gray eyes met hers, and in their depths, she saw no pity. She saw a shared understanding of pain, a quiet rage at the injustice of the world, and something else, a silent, solemn vow. "Here," the gesture said, the warmth and weight of the coat speaking for him. "In this place, with me, you are safe." The laughter from the hill had finally died down as the riders, their sport concluded, turned their horses and cantered away. Lark stood wrapped in a silent man's coat, the desperate plea of a motherless child echoing in her ears, and the weight of a choice she never thought she would have to make settling upon her. The peace she had sought was a lie, but perhaps, in the ruins of that lie, she had stumbled upon something else entirely. The first morning began in the cold and the dark. The floorboards were icy against the soles of Lark's feet as she felt her way to the hearth. Her life had been a series of other people's kitchens, of fires lit for employers who rarely saw her face. But this felt different. This was a silence she was choosing to fill. With a practiced hand, she struck flint to steel, coaxing a fragile spark onto a piece of char cloth. The flame caught, a tiny orange flower blooming in the gloom, and she fed it kindling until it grew into a steady, breathing heart for the small house. As the light pushed back the shadows, she moved with a quiet efficiency born of years of service. She ground coffee beans, the rhythmic crunching sound a welcome intrusion into the stillness. Soon, the rich, dark scent mingled with the smell of wood smoke. She found a sack of cornmeal and began to mix a batter for cornbread, her hands moving automatically through the familiar motions. This was her domain, the language of sustenance, and she was fluent in it. A small sound made her turn. Wren stood in the doorway to the single bedroom, her small frame lost in a long nightshirt, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. She watched Lark for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before padding over to the rough-hewn kitchen table and climbing onto a chair. She didn't speak, but her presence was a question. Lark smiled, a small, tentative curve of her lips. She scooped a tiny dusting of flour onto the tabletop in front of the child. Wren's small fingers hesitantly touched the white powder, smearing it across the dark wood. Her brow furrowed in concentration. The scent of the cornbread baking in the cast-iron skillet began to fill the small cabin. A warm, wholesome aroma that promised a new day. Silas was already gone. When Lark had first woken, she'd seen through the small window that the barn door was open, a lantern-yellow square against the pre-dawn indigo. He moved with the rhythms of the land, rising before the sun to tend to the world that was his responsibility. He returned as the sun was climbing high, a silhouette of tireless labor. He carried 2 heavy wooden buckets, filled to the brim from the well, his shoulders taking the strain without complaint. The muscles in his forearms were corded and hard as he set the buckets down just inside the kitchen door, exactly where she would need them. He had not been asked. He had simply observed, understood, and provided. He gave her a nod. The dust of the fields settled like a fine powder in his dark hair and beard. And then he was gone again, back to the endless work of the ranch. Their communication settled into a quiet, careful ritual. That first day, Lark found a small piece of slate and a chalk nub on a shelf, before Silas returned for the midday meal. She left it on the table with a simple message written in her neat, clean hand, soup on the stove. When she returned from hanging laundry, the slate was wiped clean. The next day, after a morning spent watching Wren draw misshapen animals in the dirt, she wrote, "Wren asks about the gray horse." The following morning, a reply was there, written in Silas's strong, spare pencil script on a scrap of wrapping paper. "She likes the gray." The notes became their conversation, a lifeline of small details. Lark would write, "I mended the back curtain," and find the reply. "Looks better." She'd leave a note. "We are low on salt." And the next day, a small cloth bag of it would be on the table when she awoke. Through these fragments, they built a fragile bridge across the chasm of his silence and her uncertainty. Each brief reply from him was an acknowledgement, a confirmation that he saw her efforts, that her presence here was making a difference. One afternoon, the sky turned the color of a bruise, the air grew heavy and still, and the birds fell silent. A sudden drenching rainstorm swept across the plains, hammering against the cabin's roof like 1,000 tiny fists. Lark rushed outside, grabbing at the clothes and sheets she had hung on the line to dry. The wind whipped her skirt around her legs and tore the wet fabric from her grasp. Silas appeared from the barn, moving with an unhurried urgency. He ignored the laundry, instead unrolling a heavy canvas tarp and beginning to secure it over the clothesline, creating a makeshift shelter. He worked with a deep familiarity, his hands knowing exactly which knots to tie, which posts could bear the strain. Lark, struggling with a flapping bedsheet, took a clumsy step backward to get a better grip. Her boot heel hit a slick patch of mud. Her feet went out from under her, and she landed with a soft, undignified squish in the newly formed puddle. For a second, she was just stunned, sitting in the mud, the cold water seeping through her dress, the absurdity of it, the wind, the rain. Her own gracelessness struck her all at once. A bubble of laughter rose in her throat, genuine and unrestrained. She threw her head back and laughed, the sound carrying over the drumming of the rain. Silas stopped his work and turned. He looked at her, sitting there covered in mud, with the rain plastering her hair to her face, and a slow change came over his expression. The stern lines around his eyes softened, the corner of his mouth, just visible in his beard, quirked upward. He didn't make a sound, but a quiet puff of air, almost a laugh, escaped his lips. He offered her a hand, his grip strong and warm, and pulled her easily to her feet. Their eyes met, and in that shared moment of unexpected humor, the silence between them changed its flavor. It was no longer the silence of strangers, of caution and distance. It was the silence of companionship, a quiet space they could now comfortably share. The rhythm of their days was slow, marked by the sun and the seasons, not the clock. Afternoons were Wren's time. The child, who had been so watchful and timid at first, began to orbit Lark like a small, curious moon. She would bring Lark treasures: a smooth gray stone, a fallen feather, a wildflower wilting in her small, warm fist. One day, tired from her morning's work. Wren fell asleep with her head in Lark's lap as they sat on the porch steps. Her small chest rose and fell in a steady, peaceful rhythm, her face finally free of its usual solemnity. Lark found herself stroking the child's tangled hair, her heart aching with a tenderness she hadn't felt in years. She began to speak softly, the words coming hesitantly at first. She told a story her own mother used to tell her, about a clever fox who had to find a new den before the winter snows came. She spoke of the fox's fears and its courage, of the warmth of the new burrow it finally dug among the roots of an old pine. Her voice, rusty from disuse, grew stronger and softer as she spoke, weaving a world of safety and comfort for the sleeping child. She wasn't just telling Wren a story. She was mending a piece of her own past, reclaiming a memory that had been buried under years of hardship. She was also learning a new language, one not spoken with the tongue. She learned to interpret the sounds of the ranch as Silas's voice. The steady, rhythmic tap-tap-tap of a chisel on wood from the barn meant he was mending a wagon wheel. The sharp, percussive clang of the hammer on the anvil told her he was shaping a new horseshoe. The soft thud of hooves in the corral was him calming the horses after a long day. The wind whistling through the cracks in the cabin walls was the land's sigh. And in it, she learned to hear the forecast. A dry wind meant more dust. A moist one promised more rain. These sounds became the narrative of her life, a constant, reassuring presence that told her she was not alone, after years of being treated as invisible, as a set of hands to be ordered about. Lark was beginning to feel seen. It wasn't in grand pronouncements or flowery compliments. It was in the way Silas's eyes would meet hers across the dinner table, a silent look of gratitude for the warm meal. It was in the way he left the best mended saddle blanket for the gentle mare he knew she liked to ride when she went to gather eggs. It was in the small, almost imperceptible nod of approval when he saw the new, brighter curtains she had sewn from an old dress. He never wrote her name in his notes, but his gaze called her Lark every single morning. One night, the wind rose to a furious howl. It battered the small cabin, making the roof timbers groan and the windows rattle in their frames. Lark lay awake, listening to the lonely, keening sound. It reminded her of other nights, in other places, when the wind had felt like an enemy, a reminder of her precarious place in the world. A deep, familiar ache settled in her lower back, a phantom of long hours spent scrubbing floors and hauling coal for ungrateful masters. For a moment, the fragile peace of the ranch felt like a dream, and she feared she would wake up to the cold reality of her old life. She rose and added another log to the fire, staying up long after the house had settled, watching the flames and wrestling with the ghosts the wind had stirred. She must have dozed off in the chair, because the next thing she knew, a new smell was cutting through the stale scent of worry and wood smoke, bacon, and eggs frying. Her eyes fluttered open. The gray light of dawn was filtering through the window. Silas stood at the stove, his broad back to her, a skillet in his hand. He had never cooked a meal in the house before. That had been her unspoken duty, the role she had assumed without discussion. He turned, seeming to sense she was awake. He had plated 2 helpings of fried eggs and bacon, alongside a piece of the previous day's cornbread. He walked over and set one of the plates on the small table beside her chair. He didn't smile, but his eyes were soft. He simply looked at her, at the weary lines around her eyes, and then made a small, quiet gesture with his hand, a gentle, downward motion that needed no translation. Rest. The simple act of kindness was so unexpected, so profound, that it pushed back all the fears the windy night had brought. It was a shield against the ghosts. Later that day, when Lark went to set the table for their supper, she found something new in its center, a simple glass jar, likely once used for preserves, now held a small, unassuming bouquet of purple wildflowers. Their stems were still damp, their petals a vibrant splash of color against the dark, worn wood of the table. She didn't know where he had found them in the dry autumn landscape. He hadn't written a note. He didn't need to. The small, stubborn flowers, beautiful in their simplicity, were the first punctuation mark in the unwritten story of their strange, silent family. Wren found the drawing tucked beneath a loose floorboard in her room, a secret stash of treasures that also included a magpie's blue feather and a smooth, egg-shaped river stone. She brought it to Lark, not with any particular reverence, but as a simple offering, holding it up with a grubby hand as Lark was kneading dough. Lark wiped her hands on her apron and took the paper. It was a page torn from a ledger, the back covered in faint columns of numbers. But the front was alive. It was a drawing done in charcoal, smudged and softened by a skilled hand. It depicted the ranch, but not as it was. It was an idealized version, a dream of it. In the center stood a great, gnarled tree, its branches bent and shaped by a powerful, invisible wind, a permanent resident of the high plains. Beneath its sheltering canopy stood 3 figures, a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his stance solid as the tree itself. A woman, her skirts rendered in soft, flowing lines, her head tilted slightly toward the man, and holding both their hands was a small child, unmistakably Wren. Lark's breath caught. It was a portrait of a family, a complete, unbroken family. The artistry was stunning in a few simple lines. Silas had captured the essence of belonging, of shelter against the constant, scouring wind. He had drawn a life he'd once had, or one he still longed for. Lark looked at the woman in the drawing, her features smudged but gentle, and felt a pang of something complex, not jealousy, but a deep, sorrowful understanding. She gently handed the paper back to Wren, her own hands trembling slightly. "It's beautiful, sweetling," she murmured. "He is a very good artist." That realization settled on her, adding another layer to the man of silence. He was not just a pair of strong hands and a guarded gaze. He was a man who held pictures like this inside him. Later that week, in the quiet lull of midday, Lark sat on the porch step with Wren between her knees, carefully brushing the tangles from the child's fine brown hair. The sun was warm on her back, and the only sounds were the buzz of a late-season fly and the soft shh of the bristles through Wren's hair. The child hummed a tuneless, contented song, leaning her head back against Lark's stomach in a gesture of complete trust. Across the yard, Silas was mending a piece of harness, his back to them. The rhythmic strike of his hammer against leather and metal had been the percussion of their morning. Suddenly, the hammering stopped. The silence felt abrupt, heavy. Lark glanced up, her hand pausing in its stroke. Silas had turned. He was standing by the open barn door, his hammer hanging loosely from his hand, watching them. His gaze was unguarded, stripped of its usual caution. It was not the look of a landowner or an employer. It was the look of a profoundly lonely man witnessing something he had been starved of. It was tender, aching, and so vulnerable that Lark felt her own chest tighten in response. She saw the softness in his eyes, a warmth that belied his rough beard and calloused hands. Then, as if realizing he was exposed, his gaze snapped away. He turned abruptly, his shoulders tense, and struck the harness with a force that was almost violent, the sudden crack of the tool making Lark flinch. He was afraid of what he felt, afraid to let that fragile picture on the porch take root in his mind. Lark learned the shape of his respect. It was not in words of praise or in grand gestures. It was in the small, quiet spaces between their labors. One morning, she misjudged her own strength, hauling a single bucket of water from the well that was too full. She staggered with it, her arms burning, determined not to ask for help, not to appear weak. She had to pull her own weight. That was the bargain she'd made with herself. Silas came out of the shed, saw her struggling. Her old employers would have either yelled at her for her stupidity or snatched the bucket away with a sigh of exasperation. Silas did neither. He simply walked past her to the well, picked up the other empty bucket, drew a full measure of water, and fell into step beside her. He didn't take her burden. He simply took his own, matching her stride. They walked back to the house side by side, their steps falling into a shared, unhurried rhythm, equals in the day's work. It was a silent, profound courtesy, an acknowledgement that her effort was as valid as his. The evenings grew colder. The slanting afternoon sun, which held little warmth, would find Lark by the hearth, the basket of mending on her lap. She was working on one of his work shirts, a faded blue flannel worn thin at the elbows and frayed at the collar. The fabric was rough beneath her fingers, stiff with the ranch's red dust and the scent of his labor. She was using her own thread, a thin, dark cotton that was a poor match, but it was all she had. She was engrossed in the small, careful stitches when his shadow fell over her. He had come in without a sound. He stood before her for a moment, watching her fingers work. Then, he reached into his pocket and placed something on the small table beside her chair. It was a new spool of thick, pale linen thread, strong and smooth. It must have come from the peddler who'd passed through the territory last week, the one she'd heard but not seen. He hadn't just bought supplies. He had seen her need, seen her act of care, and provided for it. He nodded once, a brief dip of his chin, and went to wash his hands for supper, leaving the spool gleaming in the firelight. That night, the air was sharp with the promise of frost, carrying the clean, resinous scent of pine from the high country. Wren had fallen asleep in Lark's lap as they sat on the dark porch, the child's small body a heavy, trusting weight. Lark held her close, her arms wrapped around the girl's warmth, her cheek resting on the top of Wren's messy hair. The ranch was quiet, the world reduced to the whisper of the wind through the eaves and the rhythmic breathing of the child in her arms. A profound, aching longing filled Lark, so intense it made her tremble. It was a desire to belong, not just to be useful, not just to be safe, but to be a part of this picture, this quiet porch, this sleeping child, this silent, complicated man. It was a dangerous, fragile hope, and it terrified her, as if summoned by her thoughts. Silas appeared in the open doorway. He didn't step out onto the porch, but lingered on the threshold, a tall silhouette against the warm light of the cabin's interior. He was just watching them, this image of peace he had invited into his broken home. His hand came up and rested on the wooden doorframe, his fingers spreading wide, an unconscious gesture of claiming, of holding onto the very structure of his house. Lark looked up, her eyes meeting his in the gloom. The air crackled, suddenly charged with an awareness that had not been there before. It was no longer just about gratitude or companionship. In the darkness, she could hear his breathing, a slow, deep pull of air, her own breath hitched, her heart hammering a rhythm against Wren's sleeping back. For a long, suspended moment, their breaths were out of sync, one fast and shallow, the other deep and unsteady. Then, as if by some unspoken accord, they both seemed to find the same tempo, their breathing settling into a shared quiet, a single pulse in the cold night air. His coat, the one he had placed on her shoulders that first day, had become a ritual. Every evening when the chill set in, he would lift it from the peg by the door and drape it around her. She no longer startled at his closeness. She had come to rely on the familiar weight, the scent of leather and smoke. Tonight, as she sat with Wren, she pulled the lapels closer, burying her chin in the warm wool. She watched his hand as it rested near her shoulder, his fingers flexing for a second, just once, as if fighting the urge to close, to rest on her. But he didn't. He always respected the boundary. His hand retreated, leaving her wrapped in his warmth, but untouched. That night, before she went to her small cot, she left a note on the slate by the dying fire. The wind was picking up, rattling the windows just as it had on that first fearful night. But her fear was different now. It was practical. "Wind's high tonight," she wrote. "Don't forget the barn latch." When she rose in the dark of the morning, his reply was there on the slate, which he'd placed on the kitchen table. His pencil script was clear in the first light. "I know. Thank you." She smiled, wiping the slate clean. But then she saw it, on the scrap of paper he usually used for longer replies, tucked beneath the empty coffee mug. He had written more. She picked it up. It was only 3 words, but they struck her with the force of a revelation. "Thank you, Lark." He had written her name, not Miss Mercer, not a nod in her direction, But her name, Lark. A small, simple, four-letter word. She traced the letters with her finger. Years of being girl, you, or simply an unseen presence in a room full of people. Years of feeling as disposable as a broken dish. And here, a silent man had written her name, had given her an identity in his quiet world. A sudden, surprising warmth bloomed in her chest, sharp and bright as a coal catching flame, pushing back a coldness she hadn't even realized she was still carrying. The change in the house was palpable. A tension eased. Wren, with the unerring instinct of a child, sensed it immediately. That afternoon, she came to Lark, her face a mask of serious importance. She didn't offer a stone or a feather. She offered a drawing on a piece of brittle, yellowed paper. It was a heart. It was lopsided, drawn with a piece of red chalk, the lines wobbly but drawn with great care. She pressed it firmly into Lark's hand. Then she ran to Silas, who was repairing a boot, and tugged on his trousers until he looked at her. She pointed a small, insistent finger at Lark, then at her own chest, then at him. The message was clear. She was the bridge, connecting the two silent shores of their adult hesitation. Lark looked down at the misshapen heart in her hand, then up at Silas. He was watching her, and for the first time, when their eyes met, he didn't look away. She was beginning to trust it. Not the false promise in the cruel letter, but this feeling that was growing in the silence, built of shared labor, quiet respect, and the warmth of a child. It was not a loud, declarative thing. It was a presence, as solid and real as the tabletop bluffs that defined the far horizon, a permanent, massive shape in the distance, a truth you could anchor yourself to, even if you never spoke its name. The first true cold snap of the year descended from Juniper's notch like a predator. It painted the inside of the windows with intricate ferns of frost and gave the wind a sharp, glassy edge that cut through Lark's thin shawl. The small cabin, which had felt so cozy, now seemed tall and vulnerable against the vast, freezing territory. The nights were the worst. Wren had coughed, a small, dry sound in the darkness, and Lark had piled her own blanket on top of the child's small quilt. It was not enough. They needed more bedding, more protection against the coming winter. There might be old quilts in the loft, Lark said to Wren, who was solemnly watching her breath plume in the kitchen air. I'll go see. She pulled the rickety ladder down from the ceiling hatch, the wood groaning in protest. Silas was out mending a long stretch of fence line down by the frozen creek, a job he'd left for before dawn. Lark felt a pang of guilt for intruding into what felt like the private, upper spaces of the house, but the need was practical. She climbed. The smell of dry rot, old dust, and something faintly resinous, like cedar, growing stronger. The loft was low-ceilinged and still, a graveyard of forgotten things. Dust motes danced in the single beam of light from a small, grime-caked window. There were broken pieces of harness, a cracked yoke, and several empty burlap sacks. And in the far corner, tucked under the eaves, was a large, wooden steamer trunk. It was not locked. She lifted the heavy lid. On top lay a thick, folded wool blanket, smelling strongly of camphor. Relief washed over her, but as she lifted it, her fingers brushed against something else, something soft. Beneath the blanket was not just bedding, but a life packed away, but not discarded. Her hands, rough from lye soap and hot water, first touched a pair of shoes. They were not work boots or Sunday shoes. They were moccasins, made of deer hide tanned to the color of butter, the tops covered in an intricate, beautiful pattern of tiny blue beads. They were small, clearly a woman's, and the soles showed signs of wear. They had been loved. Beside them lay a comb, carved from dark wood, its spine also inlaid with the same small, luminous blue beads. A single long, jet-black hair was still caught in its teeth. Lark felt her breath catch, a sudden coldness that had nothing to do with the weather. This was not just a trunk. It was a shrine. Her fingers found a folded piece of paper. It was not a letter. It was a drawing, the same charcoal medium as the one Wren had found, but this one was more detailed, a formal portrait. It was Silas, younger, his beard trimmed, the lines around his eyes softer, almost smiling. Beside him sat a woman. It was Alo. Lark knew it instantly. The drawing captured a spirit of profound, gentle calm. She had high, strong cheekbones, a wide, generous mouth, and eyes that were strikingly kind. Her dark hair was parted in the middle and hung in two long, thick braids that lay over her shoulders. In her lap, she held a beautifully crafted cradleboard, and nestled inside it was the sleeping face of a tiny infant. This was his family. This was the life he had built and lost. Lark looked at the woman in the sketch, the graceful line of her throat, the quiet pride in her posture, the deep, abiding love in the way Silas had drawn her. This was the woman whose ghost still lived in the set of his shoulders and the caution in his eyes. A cold, heavy weight settled in Lark's chest. She was an intruder. A hired hand who had somehow stumbled into the center of a tragedy she couldn't possibly understand. The small warmth she had begun to feel in this house, the sense of belonging, evaporated, leaving her shivering and exposed. She was a shadow, a pale imitation of the vibrant life that had been here before. Who was she, with her worn-out dresses and her past of servitude, to sit in this woman's kitchen carefully, her hands trembling? Lark refolded the drawing and placed it back in the trunk. She covered it with the moccasins and the comb. She took only the wool blanket, her original purpose. She closed the lid, the soft thud sounding final, like a handful of dirt on a coffin. She backed away and descended the ladder, her heart heavy as stone. When her feet touched the kitchen floor, the house felt alien. The walls permeated with a memory that had no room for her. She was scrubbing potatoes for the evening stew, her movements jerky and harsh, when a shadow fell across the door. It wasn't Silas. It was an older man, stooped and weathered as a lightning-struck pine, leaning heavily on a shepherd's crook. He led a single ewe with a lame foot. He nodded to Lark, his pale blue eyes watery but sharp. "Afternoon, miss," he rasped, his voice like gravel. "Name's Owen Murdoch. I run sheep over on the tabletop. Just bringing this stray back. She seems to like Crowell's grass better'n mine." "Mr. Murdoch," Lark said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mr. Crowell is mending the south fence. Can I offer you some coffee? You look frozen." "Don't mind if I do," he said, tethering the ewe to the porch rail. He gratefully took the tin mug of hot coffee, wrapping his gnarled fingers around its warmth. He didn't come inside, but stood on the porch, sipping. "Place is cleaner," he observed, looking around. "Wren's laughin', too. Heard it down by the creek bed. Ain't heard that sound from this ranch in a long time. You're doing good work here, miss." I keep the house," Lark murmured, staring into her stew pot. The image of the beaded moccasins burned into her mind. Murdoch was quiet for a long moment, watching her. "It's hard, walking into a place that holds so much silence." Lark's head snapped up. "You knew him before." Murdoch's gaze drifted toward the high, lonely peak of Juniper's Notch, which was already catching the day's last light. "Oh, yes," he said softly. "I knew Silas when he had a voice that could gentle a wild colt or fill a barn with a song. He wasn't born to this silence. Miss, it was forced on him. By this town." Lark stopped stirring, her hand frozen. What do you mean?" The old shepherd sighed, the sound a cloud of white in the cold air. "He had a wife, Elo. A finer woman never drew breath. She was from up in the high country, Paiute. I think she was different, not like the pinched-faced women in town. She knew things, knew herbs, knew the land. She healed my flock one winter when the rot set in. She was good." He took another sip of coffee, his eyes darkening. "But folks around here, especially the righteous ones, the ones who run Sagebrush Ferry, they fear what they don't understand. And they hated her for being different, hated her for being happy, and they hated Silas for choosing her over one of their own." He pointed with his chin toward the distant, hazy line of trees that marked the creek. "That winter, 4 years back, the lung fever swept the town, took 3 children. Folks went mad with grief and fear. They needed a reason. They needed someone to blame. Lark felt a cold dread creeping up her spine, colder than the wind. What did they do? They called her a witch, Murdoch spat, the word full of venom. Said she'd put a hex on the town's children. It was lies, filth and lies, stirred up by that snake oil preacher Boone, and by Barrett Voss and his kin. The Vosses always wanted this piece of land. Always. His voice dropped to a hoarse whisper. It was a Sunday, after the sermon. They were full of God and hate. They formed a mob. They came out here, alone. She was alone. Silas was in town, getting feed. No, Lark whispered. He got back as they were dragging her from the house. He heard her cry out. He went in. Miss, he went in against more than 20 men with nothing but his bare hands. I saw it. I was too far, too old, too much a coward to stop him. Tears welled in the old man's eyes. He fought like a grizzly, broke 3 arms, cracked 2 skulls, but they were too many. They had rifle butts and fence posts. Murdoch turned away, unable to look at her. They wanted to make an example. They didn't just... They took her to that big cottonwood down by the ferry. And when Silas wouldn't stop, wouldn't let her go, they turned on him. They beat him till he stopped moving. They crushed his throat with a rifle stock to silence his roaring. When it was done, Alo was gone. And Silas, he just lay in the mud and the blood. He's never made a sound since. Not one. Lark stood frozen, the tin cup she'd been holding slipping from her numb fingers and clattering onto the floor. It wasn't a sickness. It wasn't an accident. It was a scar, a brand, an atrocity carved into him by the very people who had sent her that cruel, mocking letter. The town hadn't just made him a widower. They had ripped his voice from his throat. They had silenced him. The malice of the prank was suddenly horrific, a new, monstrous layer of cruelty. Barrett Voss hadn't just mocked a mute man. He had mocked a man his own town had mutilated. He buried her up on the notch, Murdoch finished, his voice breaking. Where she could see the sunrise, the town. They never spoke of it, called it frontier justice. But it was a murder, plain and simple, and they got away with it. He handed the empty mug back to Lark. You're a good woman, miss, but you ain't just keeping house here. You're standing watch in a war zone. He nodded, pulled the ew's rope, and limped away. A lonely old man disappearing into the twilight. Lark didn't move for a long time. She just stood in the doorway, the cold seeping into her bones, until the cabin was completely dark. That night, she couldn't eat. She sat on the porch steps, huddled into her own thin shawl, refusing the coat Silas wordlessly offered her. The cold was a punishment she felt she deserved. Wren was asleep. The ranch was silent, but now the silence was screaming. It was filled with the sounds of a fight, of a woman's cry, of a man's voice being shattered. She stared out at the black silhouette of the hills and whispered to the wind, the only thing she could talk to. I can't replace her. I can't. She was everything. I'm just nothing. I'm just a shadow. The cabin door creaked open behind her. Silas stood there, bathed in the low, warm light from the hearth. He saw her, a small, dark shape, and he saw the moonlight glinting on the wet tracks of tears on her cheeks. He saw a despair that went beyond cold or weariness. A flicker of deep, understanding pain crossed his own face. He knew this kind of grief. He took a half step toward her, his hand reaching out, slate free, but then he stopped. He saw her huddled into herself, a fortress of misery, and he did something that struck Lark as the rarest form of kindness she had ever known. He didn't demand an explanation. He didn't crowd her. He didn't push his own silent questions into her space. He simply accepted her pain, honored her need to be alone with it, and slowly, quietly, retreated, closing the door and leaving her to the night. That kindness was her undoing. It was too much to bear. She couldn't stay and dishonor the memory of the woman in the trunk. She couldn't be a pale substitute for a love so powerful it had cost a man his voice. She was a lie, just like the letter that brought her here. She waited until she was sure the house was deep in its slumber. She slipped inside, The fire nothing but glowing embers, by their faint red light. She gathered her few belongings, the spare dress, the sonnets, the cruel, crumpled letter. She folded them and put them back in the cheap canvas bag. She would be gone before the sun rose. She would not be a ghost in a house already full of them. She tied the bag's drawstring, her heart a cold, dead knot. She turned to the door, her hand reaching for the wooden latch. "No!" The sound was not a word. It was a scrape of chalk on slate, harsh and desperate in the stillness. She froze, her hand hovering over the latch. She turned. Silas was not in bed. He was sitting at the kitchen table, in the dark. As she turned, he struck a match, the sudden flare illuminating his face. It was ravaged by a desperate, panicked fear she had never seen before. He lit a single candle, his hand shaking so badly it almost dropped the flame. He grabbed his slate, writing with frantic, hurried strokes, the chalk scratching loudly. He held it up. The light was dim, but the words were clear. "She is gone. I mourn her. But you are here." Lark shook her head, tears blurring her vision. "I can't," she whispered, her voice breaking. He wiped the slate clean with the heel of his hand, his eyes never leaving hers, pleading with an intensity that pinned her to the spot. He wrote again, pressing so hard the chalk stick snapped in two. He finished the words with the broken piece. "I choose you. I'm not her," Lark sobbed, the words tearing out of her. "I'm not brave. I'm not her." He shook his head, his expression almost angry in its desperation. He wiped the slate and wrote again, shoving it toward her. "Wren laughs when you are here." She did not laugh before. He wasn't done. He wiped and wrote one last time, his knuckles white as he gripped the slate. He held it up, his entire body trembling with the effort of this silent plea. "This house is warm when you sing." Lark stared at the words, her breath catching in her throat. "I choose you." It wasn't about replacement. It wasn't about her filling the space Alo had left. It was about her. Lark filling her own space. He wasn't asking her to be a ghost. He was asking her to be a presence. He was choosing her, the living, breathing, flawed woman in front of him. She still hadn't forgiven the town for the prank. She hadn't forgiven Barrett Voss. She hadn't even forgiven Silas for his part in her arrival, however unknowing. But as she looked at him, this broken, strong, silent man, fighting for her in the only way he could, she accepted the truth of the present moment. Here, in this house of ghosts and tragedy, she was not a shadow. She was seen. Her hand, which had been reaching for the door, fell slowly to her side. She looked at her canvas bag, then back at him. She let out a long, shuddering breath. She didn't unpack, not yet, but she walked past him to her small cot by the hearth and sat down. She had not left for tonight. That was enough. The fragile piece of the last few weeks was not broken. It was shattered. It was torn apart by the sound of approaching hoofbeats, not the steady, work-worn gait of a single rider, but the chaotic, aggressive drumming of many. They came with whoops and jeers, a sound of manufactured mayhem that had no purpose other than to intimidate. Inside the cabin, Wren's small hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror that was clearly learned. Lark's heart seized, a cold fist closing around it. She went to the window, pulling the edge of the new curtain back just an inch. They were there, circling the yard like coyotes testing a fence line. Barrett Voss was in the lead, his expensive saddle gleaming, a cruel, handsome smile plastered on his face. He was flanked by the 4 men Lark had only heard of, the ones Murdoch had called the Briar Boys. There was Tate Harlan, heavy and dull-eyed, who seemed to serve as Voss's muscle. Milo Creed, a thin, weasel-like man who cackled at everything Voss said. Jory Pike, whose father owned the mercantile and who looked both nervous and arrogant. And Cullen Dodd, who hung back slightly, his face watchful, more shadow than participant. 5 of them. They reined in their horses just shy of the sagging front gate, their animals restless, sensing the nervous energy of their riders. The air was thick with the smell of horse sweat and the sour tang of whiskey. "Well now," Barrett Voss boomed, his voice falsely jovial, pitching it loud enough to carry through the cabin's closed door. "Look at the little homestead. How's the happy couple as the honeymoon over? Crowl." Milo Creed let out his high-pitched, cackling laugh. "He can't answer you. Barrett, he ain't got the tongue for it." The men roared. Inside, Wren was trembling, a low, terrified whimper starting in her throat. Lark's fear was a cold, sharp thing. But seeing Wren's terror, it curdled. It changed from ice to fire, a low, burning rage she had never known she possessed. The men who had maimed this family, who had turned their grief into a cruel sport, were now at their door, demanding more. "How's the mail order prize?" Jory Pike shouted, emboldened by the whiskey. "Was she worth the stamp? Voss, did you write her a real pretty letter?" "She wasn't a prize. Jory," Barrett called back, his voice dripping with condescension as he stared fixedly at the cabin door. "She was the free gift that comes in the feed sack, something to be used up and tossed aside." He leaned forward on his saddle horn. "Hey, in there. Tell us, did the mute find a use for you, or is he just letting his new saloon girl keep the house warm?" That was it, the casual, dehumanizing cruelty of it. Saloon girl, tossed aside. It was every moment of her old life, every leering glance and demeaning assumption, thrown back in her face. But this time, it was aimed not just at her, but at this house, at this fragile, three-person world she had started to build. Wren let out a small sob. Lark moved. Her decision was not made with thought, but with pure, clarifying instinct. She turned from the window and walked to the hooks by the hearth. There hung the old, double-barreled shotgun. It had belonged to Silas's father, a relic of a past life. 2 nights ago, plagued by the wind and old Murdoch's story, she had taken it down. She had sat by the fire, cleaning it with an oiled rag, not even knowing why. She had just felt the need for a solid, tangible piece of protection in her hands. Now she knew. Her hands were steady. She checked the breech. It was loaded. Silas kept it that way. She picked up 2 more shells from the box on the mantel and slipped them into her apron pocket. "Wren," she said, her voice low and firm, cutting through the child's fear. "Go to your room. Get under the bed. And you do not come out until I come and get you. Do you understand me?" Wren's eyes were huge, but she saw the iron in Lark's gaze. She nodded, her small face pale, and scurried away, the sound of her bare feet a desperate patter on the floor. Lark took a deep breath, the smell of gun oil on her hands. She walked to the door, lifted the wooden latch, and stepped out onto the porch. The laughter and an impending crude remark died in Barrett Voss's throat. His smile faltered. The other men shifted, surprised. They had expected a cowering woman or an enraged, silent man. They had not expected this. Lark Mercer, her hair coming undone in the wind, her apron still on, standing on the top step, leveling the twin barrels of the shotgun directly at Barrett Voss's chest. The air went utterly still. The only sound was the jingle of a bridle and the wind whistling under the eaves. Lark did not raise her voice. She did not waver. She pulled back both hammers. Click, click. The sound was metallic, final, and deafening in the silence. It was the sound of a period being placed at the end of a sentence. It was the sound of a lock clicking into place. Voss's horse shied, sensing the sudden tension. He fought the reins, his face darkening from amused arrogance to a sullen, dangerous anger. "Put that down, girl," Tate Harlan growled, his hand inching toward the revolver at his hip. Lark's gaze didn't flicker. The barrels remained pointed at Voss. She spoke, and her voice was as clear and cold and hard as the gun steel in her hands. "One more word, and you will be eating sand." A wave of disbelief crossed the riders' faces. Milo Creed let out a nervous titter, which he quickly stifled. They were 5 armed men, and she was one woman with an old scattergun, but the gun was steady, and her eyes held an absolute, terrifying conviction. They were the eyes of a woman who had nothing left to lose and, for the first time, something precious to defend. "She's bluffing. Barrett," Jory Pike said, but his voice was thin. "Maybe," Voss sneered, but he didn't move. He didn't test it. The cabin door opened again, wider this time. Silas stepped out. He moved without a sound, coming to stand shoulder to shoulder with Lark. He was unarmed. He held no rifle, no pistol. His hands were empty, hanging loose at his sides. He simply stood there, a tall, solid, unmovable presence. He turned his head, his storm-gray eyes meeting Lark's for one brief second. A flash of silent, fierce approval. Then he turned his gaze forward, locking it on Barrett Voss. His silence was not weakness. It was a weight. It was a judgment. It was a wall of granite reinforcing Lark's iron. The combined force of them, the armed woman and the silent, watchful man, was more than the riders had bargained for. The fun had evaporated. This was no longer a sport. It was a standoff. Barrett Voss's hand tightened on his saddle horn, his knuckles white. He hated this. He hated being defied, especially by them. By the woman who should have been his victim and the man who was his town's standing joke. His handsome face twisted into an ugly mask of humiliation. He stared at them for a long 10 seconds, the air vibrating. Lark's arms were beginning to burn, but she would not lower the gun. She would not blink. Finally, Barrett yanked on his horse's reins, the animal rearing in protest. He spat a thick stream of tobacco juice into the dust, just short of the porch. "This ain't over," he snarled, his voice low and venomous. "This land is wasted on you, and the fun's just getting started." He wheeled his horse around, digging his spurs in. "Let's go, boys. This party's dead." Tate Harlan gave Lark one last, lingering, threatening look before following. Jory Pike and Milo Creed scrambled to turn their horses, almost tripping over each other in their haste to leave. Cullen Dodd, who had said nothing, was the last to turn, his face thoughtful as he glanced back one more time at the two figures on the porch. Lark watched them until they were a cloud of dust halfway back to the main track. She stood there, the shotgun suddenly weighing 1,000 pounds. Only when they were truly gone did she allow herself to feel the violent tremor that seized her body. Her knees buckled. She lowered the muzzle of the gun to the porch floor, leaning on it, her knuckles white. She was shaking so hard she could barely stand. The cabin door creaked. Wren peeked out, her small face streaked with tears. She saw the men were gone. She saw Lark, shaking but standing. The child flew out the door. She didn't run to Silas. She ran to Lark, throwing her small, thin arms around Lark's waist, burying her face in the folds of her apron. "Mama!" Wren sobbed, the word muffled but clear. "Mama." It was not a question. It was not a mistake born of hope. It was a choice, a statement, an anointing. Lark's hand, still smelling of gun oil, came up and clutched the back of the child's head, holding her close. She was gasping, trying to draw a clean breath, her eyes squeezed shut. Silas put a hand on her shoulder, a solid, warm, grounding weight. That's when it happened. A dark shape arced through the air from the retreating riders. A parting shot, a final, cowardly act of malice. It was a dark green bottle, thrown with all of Barrett Voss's frustrated strength. It wasn't aimed at Lark, but at the house, at the idea of them. It struck the porch post. Not 2 feet from where they stood. It exploded. Crash! The sound was a violent punctuation to the scene. Glass, wood, and cheap whiskey sprayed everywhere. Silas's reaction was not a thought. It was a reflex, forged from a life of protecting others. In one single, lightning-fast motion, he spun, sweeping his arm out to shove both Lark and Wren back toward the doorway, his own body turning to shield them from the spray of glass. He grunted, a sharp, choked sound. Lark, stumbling back, looked up. "Silas!" He stood frozen for a second, his back to her, his hand clenched on the doorframe. "Silas!" she said again, louder, her voice sharp with a new kind of fear. He turned slowly. His face was pale beneath his beard. He looked down at his left arm. his expression one of dull surprise. A dark stain was spreading rapidly across the sleeve of his flannel shirt. Just below the shoulder, a long, wicked shard of green glass was embedded there, and blood, dark and shockingly red, was welling up around it, dripping onto the clean porch boards. The world went sharp and narrow for Lark. The shaking stopped. The fear vanished, replaced by a cold, absolute focus. For the first time since she had arrived, she shouted his name, a raw cry that tore from her throat. "Silas!" He swayed, his eyes losing focus. She lunged forward, grabbing his good arm, looping it over her own shoulders, taking his weight. She all but dragged him inside, kicking the door shut behind them. "Wren!" she snapped, her voice a command. "The kettle! Put it on the fire! Now!" Wren, seeing the blood, was paralyzed. "Mama! Now!" "Wren!" Lark ordered, and the child, shocked by her tone, scrambled to obey. Lark guided Silas to the kitchen table, forcing him to sit. He slumped, his head falling forward, his face slick with a cold sweat. The kitchen, moments ago a sanctuary, was now a field hospital. The smell of gun oil on her hands mingled with the sudden, coppery scent of his blood. "All right," Lark said, her voice low and steady, talking as much to herself as to him. "All right, we can fix this." She grabbed a knife from the counter, her movements precise. She ripped open a clean flour sack for bandages. She grabbed the bottle of whiskey she kept for her own aches and pains. She looked at the wound, at the blood pulsing steadily from the cut. She looked at his pale, strained face. "This is going to hurt," she said, her voice soft but unforgiving. "Look at me. You look at me. Silas Crowell." He lifted his heavy head, his gray eyes, clouded with pain, finding hers. She had taken charge. The kitchen was hers. The wound was hers. And he, in his silent, bleeding vulnerability, was hers to save? The world outside the kitchen door ceased to exist. There was only the sharp, metallic smell of blood, the low groan of a man in pain, and the sudden, absolute clarity of Lark's purpose. She moved with a speed and certainty that surprised even herself. The years of quiet servitude transformed into an engine of efficient care. "Wren, bring me the water," she ordered, not looking at the child. Her focus was entirely on Silas, who was slumped in the chair, his good hand pressed against the wound, his face a ghastly, bloodless white under his dark beard. She took the knife she used for paring vegetables and, without hesitation, sliced through the thick flannel of his sleeve, cutting it away from his shoulder, the fabric, dark with blood. Peeled back to reveal the raw, ugly gash. It was deep, a jagged tear in the muscle, and at its center, the shard of green glass was buried like a vicious tooth. Blood pulsed from the wound in a steady, rhythmic flow that terrified her. Silas's breath was coming in shallow, ragged gasps. He flinched as the cold air hit the exposed wound, his whole body tensing. "Look at me," Lark said, her voice a low, steady command. She brought her face close to his, forcing his pain-clouded eyes to meet hers. "Silas, look at me. Breathe. Breathe with me. In and out." She exaggerated her own breathing, a slow, calming rhythm. "That's it. Stay with me." She poured a generous amount of whiskey onto a strip of clean cloth from the flour sack. The harsh, alcoholic fumes filled the small space. "This is for the cleaning," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "It's going to burn." She saw his jaw clench, a muscle knotting in his cheek. He gave a short, sharp nod, his eyes squeezed shut in anticipation. When the whiskey-soaked cloth touched the raw edges of the wound, he let out a choked, guttural sound, his body arching in the chair. It was the only sound she'd ever heard him make besides the rasp of his breathing, and it was a sound of pure, animal agony. "I know," she whispered, her own eyes stinging. "I know. Breathe. Silas, breathe through it." She worked quickly, her touch firm but as gentle as she could manage, cleaning away the blood and dirt. The whiskey stung, but it was a clean fire, a fire that would chase out the poison of the dirty glass. Next came the glass itself. It was wedged deep. She fetched a pair of pliers from his toolbox, wiping them clean with more whiskey. "All right," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "One more time. Look at me." His eyes opened. They were wide, vulnerable, filled with a trust that made her heart ache. "Breathe with me," she commanded softly. "In, out." As he exhaled, she gripped the edge of the glass shard with the pliers and pulled. It came free with a sickening, grating sound. Silas threw his head back, his teeth gritted, but he remained silent. His pain held captive behind the wall of his broken throat. Blood flowed more freely now, and she pressed a thick pad of cloth against the wound, applying all her weight. "Wren, the bandages," she said, her voice strained. The child, who had been watching with wide, terrified eyes, pushed a roll of clean, ripped sheeting across the table. For long minutes, they stayed like that, Lark pressing down, Silas breathing in a harsh, ragged rhythm. Their gazes locked. The only sounds were his breathing, the crackle of the fire, and the frantic, terrified beating of Lark's own heart. Slowly, the bleeding began to subside, slowing from a flow to a sluggish ooze. Lark let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She began to bandage the wound, wrapping the cloth tightly around his shoulder and chest. Her movements sure and practiced. With every turn of the cloth, she felt as if she were binding him not just physically, but binding him to this house, to her. When she was finished, his shoulder was a thick, white bundle. He was slumped in exhaustion, his skin clammy, his dark hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. But he was breathing more easily. The immediate danger had passed. He stirred, his good hand fumbling for the slate that still hung at his belt. His fingers were clumsy, shaking with shock and pain, but he managed to unhook it. He shakily scrawled a few words, his knuckles white. He held it up for her to see, his arm trembling with the effort. "Don't stay out of pity." The words, stark and desperate on the small board, went through her like a knife. After everything, the standoff, the wound, her fierce protective rage, his first fear was that she was now his prisoner, bound by a debt of care, that she would see him as a burden, an object of charity. Tears she hadn't known she was holding back welled in her eyes, blurring his pale, worried face. She shook her head, a single, hot tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. "Pity," she whispered, her voice choked. She reached out and rested her hand on the rough wood of the table, near his. "I'm not staying for pity." "Sss," her voice broke, but she forced the words out, the truest words she had ever spoken. "I'm staying because this place—" She looked around the small, cluttered kitchen at the mended curtains, the jar of wildflowers, the child huddled by the fire. His home. He stared at her, his gray eyes searching her face, trying to absorb the truth of what she'd said. The slate slipped from his fingers, clattering to the floor, forgotten. She reached out, her hand trembling, and gently, tentatively, brushed the damp hair back from his forehead. The touch was electric, a current of profound connection passing between them. Her palm came to rest against the rough, beard-stubbled skin of his cheek. He was warm, real, and so incredibly vulnerable. He leaned into her touch, a small, involuntary movement, his eyes closing for a moment as if in relief. A peace that had nothing to do with safety and everything to do with acceptance settled between them. His eyes opened again. His lips parted. He took a breath, a deep, shuddering intake of air. The muscles in his throat, the ones old Murdoch said had been crushed, corded with a desperate, agonizing effort. He was trying to do the one thing the world had stolen from him. He was trying to speak. A sound emerged, a raw, broken rasp, like stone grinding against stone. It was a sound of immense pain and monumental will. "Said I—" The word was a ruin, a ghost of a sound, but it was there. He swallowed, his eyes fiercely locked on hers, tears of sheer effort welling at the corners. He tried again. "Play, ease, stay, please." 2 words, dredged up from the silent, shattered depths of him. It was a plea and a prayer, a sound more powerful and intimate than any shout. It was the sound of his soul finding its voice again, just for her. A small sob escaped Wren. She ran to Silas and wrapped her tiny arms around his good leg, burying her face in his trousers. "Papa C," she mumbled, her name for him. Lark's hand slid from his cheek and came to rest on top of Wren's small head, her fingers tangling in the child's soft hair. She looked at Silas, at his face, which was a wreck of pain and hope and exhaustion, and she gave a slow, deliberate nod. "I'm staying," she said, her voice clear and sure. "I'm staying." Night fell, and the house settled into a deep, exhausted quiet. Wren was asleep on her cot, a fitful sleep filled with small whimpers. Lark had cleaned the blood from the floor and washed her hands, but she could not rest. Silas sat in the chair by the fire, his arm in a makeshift sling, watching the embers glow. The pain had etched deep lines into his face. Lark brought the basin of warm water and a fresh set of bandages. "I need to change the dressing," she said softly. "Check that the bleeding has stopped." He nodded, his gaze heavy. She knelt before him. This time, her touch was different. It was not the urgent, life-saving touch of the afternoon. It was slow, careful, and respectful. Before she unwrapped the first layer of cloth, she paused, her hands hovering just above his shoulder. She looked at him, her eyes asking a silent question. "May I?" He understood. He gave another small nod, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. His consent was given. She worked slowly, unwrapping the stained bandages. At each step, she paused, giving him a chance to object, to tell her to stop. When she touched his skin to clean the wound again, she did so with a feather-light touch, watching his face for any sign of pain. He flinched only once, a slight tightening of his jaw, but his eyes never left hers. This quiet, deliberate ritual was more intimate than 1,000 careless touches. It was an act of profound trust, a healing of more than just a physical wound. She was tending to his body with a respect he had likely not been shown since Alo. Later, when the house was settled and the moon was high, the closeness of the cabin felt stifling. Lark stepped out onto the porch, into the sharp, clean cold. The wind was a low moan, a lonely sound. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering. The door opened behind her. Silas came out, moving stiffly. In his good hand, he carried his heavy canvas coat. The coat. He came and stood beside her, not speaking, just sharing the cold and the darkness. Then, slowly, he draped the coat over her shoulders, just as he had that first day, but this time was different. She shivered and pulled the front closed, her hands fumbling with the lapels. He watched her, then lifted his good hand. His movements were slow, deliberate. He reached out and, with surprising gentleness, took the edges of the coat from her. His calloused, work-roughened fingers brushed against hers. Then, he carefully, painstakingly, fastened the top button at her throat. It was a simple, practical act against the cold, but it was also a gesture of immense tenderness, of protection, of care. He was enclosing her, keeping her warm, keeping her safe. They went back inside, to the warmth of the dying fire. They sat in the 2 chairs, the silence between them no longer empty, but full of the day's terror, of shared pain, and of a new, fragile, and powerful connection. The firelight danced on the walls, painting the small room in hues of orange and gold. Silas leaned forward slightly. He reached out, not with his slate, but with his hand. He didn't touch her face. Not yet. He simply lifted her hand, the one that had held the gun, the one that had cleaned his wound. He held it in his own, his large, warm palm enveloping hers. He studied her fingers, the small cuts and calluses from her work, as if they were the words to a story he was finally learning how to read. Then, very slowly, he raised her hand. He looked into her eyes, his own gaze searching and uncertain. He was asking another question, the most important one yet. He lifted her hand to his face. and with a touch as soft as a moth's wing. He brushed the back of her knuckles against his lips. He let her hand go and reached for hers again. But this time, he extended his index finger and gently traced the line of her jaw. His gaze dropped to her mouth. He lifted his hand, and with an agonizing, beautiful slowness, he rested the pad of his thumb against her bottom lip. It was a touch of incredible reverence. It was not a demand. It was a question, offered in the only language he had. May I Lark's breath caught in her throat. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She looked into his eyes, into their stormy, vulnerable depths, and saw her own reflection. She saw a home. She leaned forward just a fraction, a small, answering pressure against his thumb. Yes, she whispered, the word a tiny puff of air in the quiet room. His thumb brushed her lips one last time before his hand moved to cup the back of her neck, his fingers gentle in her hair. He leaned in, and his lips met hers. It was not a kiss of fire or passion. It was a kiss of quiet discovery. It was tentative, soft, a question and an answer all at once. It was the taste of wood smoke, of whiskey, of salt from her tears and his sweat. It was a kiss that spoke of shared pain and profound gratitude. When he pulled back, they simply rested their foreheads together, their eyes closed, their breaths mingling, finding a single, shared rhythm. He wrapped his good arm around her, and she leaned into his embrace. A long, quiet hug that was not about desire, but about sanctuary. It was about two broken people finding a whole, safe place in each other's arms. Outside, the old windmill groaned as it turned in the night wind. A lonely, ceaseless sound. But inside the small cabin, in the warm glow of the last embers, a silent vow had been forged. Barrett Voss had thrown a bottle to shatter their peace. Instead, he had only cemented it. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The first act of the new era was one of creation. The cabin, for all its sturdy utility, lacked softness. It lacked the small, unnecessary things that turned a shelter into a home. Lark, with Silas's healing arm still bound in a sling, took it upon herself to build them. She found a stack of old shipping crates behind the barn, their wood weathered silver but still strong. She spent an afternoon prying them apart, the shriek of the nails pulling free a satisfying, purposeful sound. Her hands, already calloused, grew sore as she sawed the boards into uneven lengths. Silas sat on the porch, his good hand sharpening a knife. Watching her, he didn't interfere. He didn't offer to take over, which she knew he couldn't. He simply watched, his presence a quiet, supportive shadow. She hammered the pieces together by the hearth, her blows clumsy at first, the nails bending, but she persisted, her jaw set in concentration. By evening, a small, slightly crooked bookshelf stood proudly by the fire. It was the first piece of furniture the house had seen that wasn't built for pure survival. That night, she retrieved her two precious books, the worn volume of sonnets and the small, empty ledger she'd bought in the town before leaving for the ranch. She placed them on the top shelf. Then, with a pencil stub, she began to write in the ledger. She wrote from memory, the stories her mother had told her, the ones about clever magpies and brave, lost children. She was transcribing her own past, anchoring her history to the walls of this house. When she was done, she took the small, dried sprig of purple wildflower, the one that had been in the glass jar, and pressed it between the pages. A new memory, laid to rest alongside the old. While Lark built with wood and words, Silas built with shadows. His right arm was strong, and his hands, which had been so powerful in their violence and so tender in their care, still held their artistry. He sat with Wren at the kitchen table. The two of them focused intently on a large piece of slate. He would take a nub of charcoal from the cold hearth and, with a few swift, economical lines, create a world. He was teaching her to speak his language. A curve and 4 lines became a horse, a smudge and a V became a bird in flight. He would draw a bucket, then a question mark. Wren, at first confused, soon caught on. She would point to the drawing, then to the full water buckets by the door. and nod vigorously. He had asked her a question. Soon, she was drawing, too. Her pictures were the wobbly, earnest attempts of a 4-year-old, a lopsided circle for the sun, a stick figure with a huge, smiling head that she pointed to and identified as Lark. She was no longer a silent, fearful witness. She was a participant. She would grab the charcoal and draw a frantic, messy scribble, pointing to the door, her way of telling them the wind was high. She was finding her voice in his, her boldness growing with every black line she drew on the slate. Lark turned her attention to the house itself. It was clean, but it was drab. It held the memory of grief, its colors the muted tones of dust and sorrow. Lark decided this would not stand. She took down the heavy, grim-colored sacking that had served as curtains. She sacrificed 2 of the ranch's empty flour sacks, scrubbing them in lye soap and boiling them until they were a soft, creamy white. Then, using a small, precious packet of blue dye she'd hoarded, she dyed them. They came out a pale, watery blue, the color of the sky just before sunrise. When she hung them, the light in the cabin changed. It was no longer a harsh, dusty glare. It was a soft, hopeful glow. She took on the mending with a new vigor. She sat by the fire, not as a servant, but as a guardian. She darned every one of Wren's tiny, threadbare socks, her stitches small and neat. A fortification against the coming cold. The act of pulling the soft wool over the darning egg felt intimate, a physical act of mothering. She found a half-used tin of whitewash in the shed and painted the dingy cupboard by the stove. The kitchen brightened, reflecting the new light from the pale blue curtains. The house was beginning to look like them scrubbed, mended, and brighter than before. Her transformation was not just internal. She felt a need to be more than the keeper of the house. She needed to be a partner in the ranch. One clear, cold afternoon, she took a lariat down from its peg in the barn. She'd watched Silas before his injury, his movements a fluid, effortless dance. She tried it herself. She swung the rope, and it collapsed into a useless pile at her feet. She tried again, putting too much force into it, the loop twisting and striking her own shoulder. Frustration burned in her cheeks. Silas came to stand beside her, his sling a stark white against his dark shirt. He watched her for a long moment. Then, with his good hand, he reached out. He didn't take the rope. He simply adjusted her grip, turning her wrist just slightly, positioning her thumb. It was a brief, impersonal touch, but it was the touch of a teacher. He stepped back and nodded at the fence post. "Try again." She took a breath, feeling the new balance in her hand. She swung the rope, a slow, building circle, and released. The loop sailed, wide and perfect, and settled cleanly over the top of the post. Lark stared, astonished. A laugh, bright and surprised, burst from her. She looked at Silas. He wasn't smiling, not with his mouth, but his eyes were. They were crinkled at the corners, filled with a bright, clear light of amusement and pride. It was a silent laugh, more potent than any sound. He stepped forward and clapped her firmly on the shoulder with his good hand, a single, solid gesture of congratulations. Well done. Even the animals seemed to sense the change. The gray horse, the one Wren loved and Silas called Soot, had always been as skittish and reserved as its master. It tolerated Lark's presence, but nothing more. But now, as she passed the corral, she held out a piece of apple she had saved. The horse, which usually shied away, stood still. It watched her, its dark eyes intelligent. Then it took a step forward, lowered its great head, and with a soft, whiskery exhale, nuzzled her open palm, lipping the apple from her hand. Lark stroked its strong, smooth neck, her heart swelling. The peace was real. It was so real, even the beasts of the field could feel it. The peace held for 12 days. On the 13th, Owen Murdoch returned. He didn't have a lame ewe this time. He had news. He accepted a cup of coffee and sat on the porch, his old eyes taking in the pale blue curtains in the window. "Healin' well, Silas?" he asked. Silas, sitting on the top step, nodded. Murdoch swirled the coffee in his tin mug. Good, good. You're gonna need that arm. Lark, who was sweeping the porch, paused. Mr. Murdoch, what's wrong? It ain't what's wrong yet, the old man rasped. It's what's coming. I was in Sagebrush Ferry, paying my bill at Pike's. I heard things. That joke. He spat the word. That Barrett Voss played on you. It wasn't just a drunk boy's prank. Miss Lark. Silas went very still. The Voss family, Murdoch continued, his voice low. They don't just own the biggest cattle spread. They own the Sagebrush Ferry Bank, and the bank owns the notes on near every small rancher in this territory, including me, and, I found out, including Silas. Lark felt a cold dread settle in her stomach, pushing out the warmth of the coffee. Silas's note is from his father, but the bank bought it up last year, quietly. Barrett Voss ain't just a bully looking for a laugh. He's an heir looking for an empire. He's been pushing folks out, calling in loans they can't pay, using strong-arm tactics when the law ain't enough. That trouble they caused, that was a test. They're trying to spook Silas, trying to make him run. The shotgun, she realized, hadn't ended anything. It had just been the first shot in a war she hadn't known they were fighting. They want this land, Murdoch said, staring at Juniper's Notch. It's got the best water access in the county, and Barrett Voss is a man who takes what he wants. The letter, the taunts, the bottle. That was just him playing with his food. The real bite is yet to come. That night, Lark did not write in her ledger of memories. She sat by the fire and she sewed. She took a bolt of heavy canvas Silas had in the shed and the new linen thread. She worked with a fierce, quiet intensity. Her hands, now strong from the saw and the lariat, pushed the heavy needle through the thick cloth. She made 3 bags, a large, sturdy satchel for Silas, with a wide strap he could wear crossbody, a smaller one for herself, for her supplies when she went to town, and a tiny pouch for Wren, just big enough to hold her charcoal and a few treasures. From a piece of old, ruined harness leather, she cut thin strips and hand-stitched a matching brown border on all 3. When she was finished, she set them on the table. 3 different sizes, 3 different purposes, but they were a set, cut from the same cloth, bound by the same leather. 3 separate pieces. Now one. When Silas rose for his pre-dawn work, he saw them. He saw the bookshelf, the curtains, the mended socks in a neat pile, and the 3 matching bags. Lark found his note later that morning, tucked under the glass jar, which she had filled with new, hardy autumn grasses. Her hands trembled as she read the strong pencil script. Thank you for making this house a home. She held the note to her chest for a long time. She thought of her arrival, of the shame and the dust. She thought of his silence and of Alo's trunk. She thought of the word Mama cried out in fear, and Stay rasped in pain. She took the pencil and a scrap of paper. She wrote her reply and left it on his empty dinner plate. Thank you for giving me a place to belong. That evening, Wren, who had been watching all of this with her solemn, observant eyes, marched to the wall. She was holding one of her own charcoal drawings. It was not a horse or a cloud. It was a family. It was, unmistakably, 3 people. A very tall stick figure with broad shoulders, a smaller stick figure beside it in a triangle skirt, and a tiny stick figure in the middle, holding both their hands. Behind them, she had drawn a long, wavering line for the fence, and behind that, the distinct, dual-peaked silhouette of Juniper's Notch. It was her new family portrait. She had hammered a nail into the wall all by herself, and she hung the drawing in the center of the room. A declaration. They ate supper in a silence that was richer and more comfortable than any conversation. The stew was thick with potatoes and rabbit, and the wild fennel Lark had found gave it a warm, sweet aroma. Wren hummed as she ate. Lark looked at the new drawing, then across the table at Silas. His arm was healing. His eyes met hers over the rim of his cup, and in them, she saw not the storm, but the calm at its very center. The house was safe. They were a home. But outside, the wind was rising, and Lark knew, with a cold, hard certainty, that Owen Murdoch was right. The real storm, The one named Voss had not yet broken. The kitchen, once a sanctuary, had become a war room. The battle would not be fought with a shotgun. Lark now understood. That had been a single, desperate act of defense. The war, as Owen Murdoch had laid bare, was one of paper, influence, and whispers. And wars like that were won with ink, evidence, and a truth spoken so loudly it could not be ignored. Lark sat at the table, the embers of the morning fire painting a low, red light on her hands. Between them lay the letter, not her mother's ledger or the book of sonnets, but the original, cruel document that had brought her here. She no longer looked at it with the burning, agonizing shame of that first day. She looked at it with the cold, dispassionate eye of an analyst. She was no longer its victim. She was its investigator. She had read it 100 times, but now she saw it differently. The handwriting was indeed neat, but it had a slight, arrogant flourish she'd overlooked. It was the handwriting of someone educated, someone used to signing documents, not the rough script of a simple prankster. Then she saw the ink. It was a deep, peculiar purple, but in the weeks it had been in her bag, it had begun to fade unevenly, turning a brownish violet in the creases. It was a cheap, short-lived ink, and the wax seal. She had thought it a generic, meaningless stamp. But now, holding it to the light, she saw the design. It wasn't a family crest. It was a dove, descending, with an olive branch, a symbol of peace, a symbol of the church. The next day, she told Silas she needed supplies. She bundled Wren in her warmest coat, and the three of them rode the wagon into Sagebrush Ferry. The tension of their arrival was a physical thing. People stared. Men who had once jeered now looked away. A mixture of fear and grudging respect. They had heard about the standoff. Lark left Silas and Wren with the wagon, instructing Wren to practice her letters on the small slate. She walked into Pike Son's Mercantile, the bell over the door announcing her with a cheerful, lying jingle. Jory Pike was behind the counter, his father beside him. When Jory saw her, he flushed a dark, guilty red and busied himself with a stack of ledgers. His father, a thin, severe man, nodded at Lark. "Miss." Lark practiced the voice she had been rehearsing in her mind, calm, pleasant, slightly vacant, the voice of a woman who was no threat. "Good day, Mr. Pike. I need flour, salt, and—" "Oh, dear," she said, feigning mild frustration. "I seem to be out of ink. I had a bottle of purple, but it's faded to just nothing. Mr." Pike turned. "Ah, yes, that'd be the new shipment of violet ink. We're the only ones who carry it. Fast to fade. That one. Folks prefer it for temporary notices, not for ledgers." He placed a small, square bottle on the counter. The label was a bright, gaudy purple. It was the one. As he was bagging her flour, Lark's gaze drifted to a stack of flyers on the counter. They were for the upcoming Founders' Day celebration, a day of thanksgiving and community, the flyer proclaimed. And at the bottom of each one was a small, pressed wax seal, identical to the one on her letter, a descending dove. "That's a lovely seal," she commented idly. "Paying for her goods, Mr." Pike grunted. "Preacher Boone's idea. He had it made special. Likes to put the church's mark on all the town's business." Lark's blood ran cold. The ink was from Pike's, Jory Pike's store. The seal was from Preacher Boone's church. This was not just the Briar Boys. This was a conspiracy. Her next stop was the one she dreaded most. She told Silas she would be just a moment more. She walked to the edge of town, to the Golden Nugget Saloon. It was early afternoon, and the place was quiet, smelling of stale beer and quiet despair. She pushed open the bat-wing doors, her heart hammering. A woman was on the small stage, not singing, but tuning a guitar. She had hair the color of a dark copper penny and eyes that looked like they had seen everything and were impressed by none of it. This was Nella Bird. Nella looked up as Lark entered, her fingers stilling on the strings. She raised an eyebrow. "You look lost. Honey, church is 2 streets over." "I'm not lost," Lark said, walking directly to the stage. "My name is Lark Mercer. I live at the Arrow and Cloud Ranch. Nella's expression changed from bored to intrigued. So, you're the one, the mail order joke. I'm the one, Lark agreed, her voice steady. And I need your help. I heard you were in here the night they planned it, the night they bragged. Nella's eyes hardened. I hear a lot of things. Drunk men brag about everything from their horses to their… Well, never mind. What I hear's my business, honey. It's how I stay safe. Barrett Voss threw a bottle at our house 2 weeks ago, Lark said, her voice dropping. It wounded Silas Crowell. They're not just boys. They're dangerous. And they're not just playing pranks. They're trying to steal his land. Nella's face was unreadable. Voss owns this town. He owns the bank. He owns the sheriff. And he owns the silence of men who know better. You can't fight him. I'm not asking you to fight him, Lark said. I'm asking you to tell the truth. I'm asking you to be a witness. A witness. Nella let out a short, harsh laugh. For who a mute rancher and his mail-order bride against Barrett Voss? They'd run me out of this territory on a rail. If I was lucky. What if he was stopped? Lark pressed. What if he couldn't hurt you? Nobody can promise that. I know you have a younger sister, Lark said softly. Sarah. She works at the laundry. A pretty girl. This territory is hard on pretty girls, especially when they don't have protection. Nella's hand clenched on the neck of the guitar, her knuckles white. You leave her out of this. I want her to stay out of this, Lark said, her gaze unwavering. I want her to be safe. If Voss is allowed to do this to us, he's allowed to do anything to anyone. You, your sister. If you testify, if we expose him, we can protect each other. I will stand with you. Silas will stand with you. Nella stared at her for a long, agonizing minute. She saw the iron in Lark's spine, the total lack of fear. She sighed, a long, weary sound. Damn you, she whispered. Damn you for being right. She nodded once. All right, I'll do it. I heard 'em. Barrett, Jory, and Milo Creed. They were drunk as skunks, laughing about how they'd found a charity case woman's name in a church donation box. How Barrett had written the letter himself, to lure the stray in. And how Preacher Boone had given him the church seal, said it would lend the prank an air of Christian charity. I'll tell it. But you'd better have a plan. Honey, because if this goes wrong, we're all buried. Lark returned to the wagon, her mind racing. The final piece of the puzzle arrived that evening, delivered by Owen Murdoch. He brought a folded, creased document, his old hands shaking as he gave it to Lark. This is it, he said. It's a copy. My contact at the bank. He owed me a favor. This is the foreclosure notice Barrett's father drew up. It's all ready. All it needs is a default on Silas's part. It claims he's missed 3 payments, which is a lie, but look at the bottom. Lark and Silas looked. There, faint but unmistakable, was a signature at the bottom of the witness line, Ellis Boone. The preacher is witnessing a false document for the bank. Lark breathed. The letter, the seal, the loan. It's all one and the same. That night, the kitchen was no longer a kitchen. It was a command center. While Lark went over the documents, Silas worked. He was still in a sling, but his good arm was strong. He took his kitchen knives to the whetstone. The shing, shing, shing of steel on stone, a sharp, rhythmic, and dangerous sound. He was not just sharpening them for carving meat. He was sharpening them for a fight. He meticulously checked the hinges on the doors, the latches on the windows, driving in new wooden pegs to reinforce them. The house was being hardened, secured. On the large kitchen table, he unrolled a piece of old butcher paper. With a charcoal stick, he began to draw. He drew the ranch house, the barn, the creek. He drew the high ground of Juniper's Notch. He sketched sight lines from the windows. Then he drew a small X under a loose stone in the hearth, a hiding place. Lark nodded. She put the letter, the foreclosure document, and a written, signed statement from Nella Bird into a small oilcloth packet. Silas slid the stone aside and tucked the packet into the dark, cold space beneath. Before bed, Lark sat with Wren. We're going to play a new game, she said, her voice light and calm. It's a secret tapping game. If you're ever in the house and you see a man you don't know, a stranger, you go to the table and you tap twice, like this. She tapped the wood. Tap, tap. That's our secret. It means, I'm here, and I'm quiet. Can you do that? Wren, her eyes wide, nodded. Tap, tap. A new, grim lesson in their silent language. That night, Lark laid the plan out for Silas, her voice a low murmur in the quiet house. We can't go to the sheriff. He's a Voss man. We can't go to the bank. They are the Vosses. And we can't go to the church, because Boone is with them. Silas watched her, his face grim. But in 3 days, she said, her eyes bright with a cold, clear fire. It's Founders' Day. The entire territory will be in town. The ranchers, the shepherds, the miners, the families. They'll all be in the square, listening to speeches, listening to Preacher Boone talk about community. She leaned forward. That's our courtroom. The sun will be our interrogator. And the town, the entire town will be our jury. We do it then. We lay it all out in the open. The letter, the seal, the forged loan, Nella's testimony. They can't silence a whole town. Silas was very still. He looked at her, his gaze intense, searching. He was weighing the risk. He was looking at the woman who had faced down 5 riders with a shotgun, and who was now proposing to face down an entire power structure with nothing but the truth. He picked up his slate. He wrote slowly. The words pressed deep into the stone. He held it up. It did not say, "It's too dangerous," or, "What if we fail?" It said, "I will stand with you." The trap was set. Lark sent word to Nella, who, true to her word, began to spread a rumor in the saloon. She told Milo Creed with a wink that she was working on a very special new song for Founders' Day. A song dedicated to the cleverest gentlemen in Sagebrush Ferry, the ones who write such convincing letters. The bait was laid. The night before Founders' Day, the house was quiet, a tense, humming quiet. Wren sat by the fire, practicing a sentence Lark had written for her on a piece of paper. The child's brow was furrowed as she slowly sounded out the words. The truth is the best thing to tell. It was the first lesson of a new life, a lesson in a world where words were weapons, before she went to her own cot. Lark went to the hook by the door. She took down the heavy brown canvas coat, Silas's coat, the one he had wrapped around her on that first terrible day, the one that had smelled of pine and leather and safety. She folded it carefully, her hands smoothing the worn fabric. Then she took the cruel, stained letter that had been her shame and tucked it deep inside the coat's inner pocket. It was not a ghost anymore. It was evidence. It was a memory she had tamed, and tomorrow it would be her sword. Founders' Day in Sagebrush Ferry was a performance of civic pride. Red, white, and blue bunting was draped, slightly askew. From every awning, the air, usually thick with dust and the smell of a livestock, was layered with the aroma of roasting pork and the sweet, cloying scent of the Ladies' Church Auxiliary's apple pies. The entire territory, it seemed, had converged on the central square, a dusty patch of ground now teeming with ranchers in their Sunday best, miners blinking in the unfamiliar sun, and families with scrubbed-clean children. Lark, Silas, and Wren arrived not as a family seeking celebration, but as a quiet, determined tactical unit. Lark wore her one good dress, a simple gray wool, and Silas's coat. The coat felt like armor. Silas, his left arm still in a clean white sling, wore a dark shirt, and his expression was as unreadable as a stone wall. His very presence was a silent declaration of defiance. He held Wren's hand, a small anchor in the swirling crowd. They stood at the edge of the square, near the horse trough, watching. On the newly constructed speakers platform, Preacher Boone was pontificating, his voice a smooth, practiced balm of righteousness. He spoke of community, of Christian fellowship, of the bonds that made Sagebrush Ferry a beacon of decency in a harsh land. Lark watched him, her stomach churning at the hypocrisy. Beside him sat the town's other luminaries, Mr. Pike, looking severe. Sheriff E.P.H. Rainey, a portly man whose main civic duty seemed to be polishing his badge, and the Voss family patriarch, a hard, cold man who looked upon the crowd as if counting his cattle, and in the front row, preening, was Barrett Voss. He was magnificent in his arrogance, his silver conchoed saddle thrown over the rail, his fine leather boots polished to a high sheen. He was the young prince, accepting nods and smiles, slapping the backs of his cronies, Tate, Milo, and Jory. They laughed too loudly at his jokes, a small constellation of sycophants orbiting his bright, cruel star. He caught Lark's eye across the square and gave her a slow, insolent wink, a look that said, "You see, this is my world. You are nothing." Lark did not look away. She simply held his gaze until he, unnerved by her lack of reaction, turned back to his admirers. When Preacher Boone finished his sermon on decency, the mayor announced a musical interlude. Nella Bird climbed onto the platform, her copper hair aflame in the midday sun. She looked out over the crowd, her gaze cool and professional. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod in Lark's direction. It was time. Barrett Voss leaned forward, a smirk on his face, clearly expecting a bawdy saloon tune. Nella strummed a simple, plaintive chord. Her voice, when it came, was not the rowdy belt of the saloon, but a clear, sad, and beautiful folk melody. "Oh, the wind blows cold on the high chaparral," she sang, "and a lonely heart can stray, so a man might write him a pretty, pretty letter to while the time away." A few people in the crowd chuckled. It sounded like a standard tale of a lonely homesteader. Barrett winked at Jory Pike. "He writes of peace and a solid roof." Nella continued, her voice gaining a sharp, ironic edge. "Of a life that's good and true. He uses fancy paper and a purple ink that fades away from view." Jory Pike's smile faltered. He glanced nervously at the bottle of identical ink on his father's store shelf not 50 feet away. "He seals his promise, a sacred trust, so the lonely heart will believe, with a holy dove, a sign of peace, from a preacher's very own sleeve." The laughter in the crowd died. A low murmur rippled through the square. People began to look at each other, then at the platform, then at Preacher Boone, whose face had gone a blotchy, unhealthy red. He began to sweat, dabbing at his forehead with a handkerchief. Nella's voice rose, losing its sadness and gaining a hard, ringing anger. "He calls for a bride, a prize to be won, a joke for 5 young men, for Barrett and Tate and Milo and Jory, to laugh and laugh again." She stopped strumming. The silence was absolute, and in that silence, she pointed, not with her hand, but with the neck of her guitar, a single, sharp, accusing gesture. She pointed it directly at Barrett Voss, then she pointed it at Jory Pike, then at Milo and Tate. The crowd gasped as one. This was not a song. This was an accusation. Before the murmur could erupt into chaos, Lark moved. She handed Silas's coat to Wren. "Hold this for me, sweetling," she whispered. Then she walked, her back straight, her head high, directly toward the platform. The crowd parted for her as if she were a ghost. She stepped up onto the platform as Nella stepped back. She was not angry. She was not crying. She was terrifyingly calm. She walked to the center of the stage, to the podium where the preacher had just spoken of God. From her pocket, she pulled the letter. She unfolded its worn creases and held it up for all to see. "This is the letter," she said, her voice not loud, but carrying with a perfect, chilling clarity in the stunned silence. "This is the promise of a home, written in an ink that fades, because the promise was never meant to last." She pointed to the bottom. "And this is the seal, a dove, the seal of the Sagebrush Ferry Community Church." She turned her gaze on Preacher Boone. "A holy seal, used for a cruel, unholy joke." Boone half rose from his chair. "Now, see here, this is slander. I had no—" "Be quiet, preacher," a new voice rasped. Owen Murdoch, leaning on his crook, had limped his way to the front of the platform. He held up another document. Because while we're talking about documents with your name on them, let's talk about this one. He didn't need to get on the platform. His voice, weathered by 1,000 storms, was strong enough. This is a foreclosure notice, prepared by the Voss Bank, for the Arrow and Cloud Ranch. It claims Silas Crowell is in default. It claims an interest rate so high it would be theft in any honest territory. And whose name is at the bottom? Witnessing this fraudulent document, Reverend Ellis Boone. The crowd erupted. The words fraud, theft, and preacher were a volatile combination. Boone sank back into his chair as if he'd been punched. Barrett Voss had seen enough. His face was a mask of pure fury. His joke, his power play, was unraveling in front of the entire world. He lunged forward, not at Lark, but at the woman who had started it. He raised his hand, the flat of his palm open, to strike Nella Bird across the face and silence her forever. His hand never landed. It was stopped, mid-air, an inch from her cheek. Silas was there. He had moved with a speed that was almost invisible, vaulting onto the platform in a single, fluid motion. He had not thrown a punch. He had not made a sound. He had simply caught Barrett's wrist in his one good hand. The crowd fell silent again, watching. Barrett was strong, but Silas's grip was like a blacksmith's vice. Barrett struggled, his face contorting with effort and humiliation, but he could not break free. Silas just held him there, his arm extended, displaying Barrett's intended act of violence for the entire town to witness. He looked directly into Barrett's eyes, and his gaze was more powerful than any blow. It was a look of profound, weary, and absolute finality. It said, "No more, not in my house, not to these women. Enough, finally." Sheriff E.P.H. Rainey heaved himself to his feet and bustled forward. All right, that's enough of this," he blustered, his face slick with sweat. He was a man caught between his masters and a mob. He chose the mob. "Let him go! Crowell!" Silas held the grip for 1 second longer, then released it. Barrett stumbled back, cradling his wrist, his eyes burning with a hatred that was almost pure. "What is the meaning of this?" the sheriff demanded, looking at Lark. "The meaning," Lark said, her voice ringing with authority, "is that crimes have been committed. Fraud, conspiracy, malice. Ask them." She pointed to the back of the church delegation. "Ask the acolytes who were there when the preacher loaned his seal for a bit of fun." 2 young men in ill-fitting suits turned pale. All eyes were on them. One of them, a boy of no more than 17, cracked. We didn't know," he stammered. "Preacher Boone just said Mr. Voss needed a stamp for a letter, for a joke. We didn't know what it was for." The confirmation sent another shockwave through the crowd. This was real. It had all happened just as the saloon singer and the mail-order bride had said. The women in the crowd, the mothers and wives, looked at Lark with a new understanding. They knew what it was to be vulnerable, to be the subject of a man's cruel sport. The small ranchers and homesteaders looked at the foreclosure notice in Murdoch's hand and saw their own precarious futures. This wasn't about a joke anymore. This was about power. This was about them. Lark turned her back on the sheriff, on the preacher, on all of them. She faced Barrett Voss directly. Her voice was level, calm, and utterly devoid of fear. "You thought this was about me," she said, so only he could hear, but in the silence, her words carried. "You thought you could humiliate me, use me, and throw me away, but you miscalculated. You didn't just humiliate me. You tried to steal the home and the land of a man you had already robbed of his voice. You thought he couldn't speak for himself. Well, today, you will listen." Barrett stared at her, his breath coming in ragged pants. He looked to his friends for support, for backup, for the strength of the pack. Tate and Milo looked at the ground, suddenly fascinated by their own boots. He looked at Cullen Dodd. Cullen met his gaze for a second, then gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. He took 1 step backward, away from Barrett. The alliance was broken. No one was willing to be buried alongside him. Sheriff Rainey, seeing the tide had turned irrevocably, found his official voice. "Barrett Voss," he announced, trying to sound authoritative. "In light of these, allegations, I'm placing you in temporary custody pending an investigation." He nodded to his deputy. "And Reverend Boone, I believe you and I need to have a long talk about the separation of church and bank statements." Two deputies, looking apologetic but firm, moved toward Barrett. The low, angry murmur of the crowd was beginning to change. It started with a single, sharp sound. Old Man Murdoch, banging the butt of his shepherd's crook against the wooden platform. Thump! Then another person clapped. Then another. It was a scattered, ragged sound at first, but it grew. It swelled from the housewives, the blacksmiths, the cowhands. It became a steady, solid, undeniable wave of applause. It wasn't for the sheriff. It was for her. For them. Lark stood in the center of the platform, the sound washing over her, her legs suddenly feeling weak. She had done it. She had spoken the truth, and the truth had been enough. She felt a warm, strong hand enclose hers. It was Silas. He had come to stand beside her, his good hand holding hers tightly. He did not look at the crowd. He looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw a pride so fierce and a love so deep it took her breath away. They stood there, together, on the stage in front of the entire territory, their hands clasped. It was the first time they had touched so publicly. A new kind of seal, a pact made not in the shadows of a quiet cabin, but in the full, bright, unforgiving light of the sun. The journey back from Sagebrush Ferry was a silent one. The applause of the crowd, the shocked faces, the sight of Barrett Voss being led away by a reluctant sheriff, it all seemed to belong to another world, another lifetime. As their wagon rattled along the dusty track, the world shrank until it was just the three of them, Silas, his shoulders finally losing their rigid tension. Wren, asleep in Lark's lap, her small face peaceful, clutching the sleeve of Silas's coat, and Lark herself, feeling a quiet so profound it was almost a sound. The night that followed was a conversation between the sky and the earth. A wind, smelling of damp soil and distant rain, swept down from the high peaks of Juniper's Notch. It rattled the new blue curtains and whispered through the eaves, not with the angry howl of a threat, but with the cleansing sigh of a coming storm. Inside, the cabin was an island of warmth and stillness. The hearth held a bed of deep red coals, their glow pulsing like a slow, sleeping heart. The silence in the room was not empty. It was full of the day's unspoken emotions, a shared exhaustion, and a deep, bone-weary peace. Wren was already deep in a dreamless sleep, worn out by the excitement and the tension she had absorbed with a child's porous sensitivity. She lay on her small cot, her rag doll tucked under her arm, her breathing a soft, steady rhythm in the quiet. Lark stood over her for a long moment, pulling the quilt up to the child's chin. She had stood on a stage and faced down a mob to protect this small, breathing, fragile piece. She gently, quietly, closed the thin wooden door to the small bedroom, enclosing the child in a sanctuary of her own. When she turned, she expected to see Silas by the fire, but he was not there. The main room was empty. A flicker of unease went through her, but it was quickly replaced by an instinct, a pull. She walked to the front door and opened it. He was on the porch, a tall, dark silhouette against the deep indigo of the twilight sky. He was looking out toward the notch, toward the place where the wind was born. He must have heard the soft click of the latch, because he turned, and the way he looked at her in that moment was something she would remember for the rest of her life. His eyes, in the low light, were not the color of a winter storm, but of a deep, calm lake at dusk, and they welcomed her reflection as if she were the rising moon. She walked out and stood beside him, pulling the door closed behind her. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The day had been full of words, of accusations and testimony. The night was for something else. They stood for a long time, side by side, watching the clouds gather and race across the sky, listening to the world breathe. The wind whipped a loose strand of her hair across her face, and she shivered. Not from the cold, but from the sheer, overwhelming reality of the moment. They had won. Silas turned to her. He lifted his good hand, his right hand, the one that had held a pen, a hammer, a charcoal stick, and a villain's wrist. He moved slowly, giving her every possible chance to turn away, to retreat. He was not assuming, he was offering. He gently placed his fingers under her chin, tilting her face up to his. His touch was warm, his calloused skin a familiar, comforting texture against hers. His gaze dropped from her eyes to her lips. His thumb, rough and sure, rose and brushed against her bottom lip, a touch as light as a whisper. It was a question, more eloquent and more vulnerable than any words could ever be. A slight, almost imperceptible tremor in the tip of his thumb betrayed the depth of the emotion behind the gesture. "May I?" it asked. "After all of this, are you here with me?" Lark's breath hitched. She could feel her own heartbeat, a steady, powerful drum in her chest. She looked into his eyes and saw the long, painful road that had led them to this porch, to this moment. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of consent, a gesture of arrival. He leaned down, and his lips met hers. The first touch was brief, a soft, questioning pressure. He pulled back a fraction of an inch, giving her space, his eyes still holding hers. She did not retreat. She leaned into him, closing that small space, and the second kiss was deeper, a slow, mutual discovery. It was a kiss that tasted of the rain-scented wind and the wood smoke in their clothes. They were learning a new language, a new rhythm, the silent, certain vocabulary of us. A low rumble of thunder echoed from the mountains. A moment later, the first drop of rain struck the tin roof of the porch. A single, sharp plink, then another and another, until it was a soft, steady drumming, a gentle percussion for their quiet world. The sound was so peaceful, so fitting, that a small laugh escaped Lark's lips, a puff of warm air against his. Silas pulled back, and in the gloom she could see the soft light in his eyes. He wrapped his good arm around her, pulling her close against his chest. It was not an embrace of passion, but of homecoming. It was safe. It was solid. He held her loosely, his hand resting on the small of her back, allowing her to set the distance, to lead the way. She leaned her head against his shoulder, listening to the rain and the steady, reassuring beat of his heart beneath her ear. When the chill finally found them, they moved inside, closing the door on the rain and the wind. The fire had burned down to a deep, mesmerizing bed of coals, casting a warm, flickering light that made the shadows dance. The room was intimate, safe, a world away from the judgment of the town square. Lark stood before the hearth, feeling the radiant heat on her skin. She was still wearing her plain gray dress, the dress of a respectable woman who had gone to plead her case. She looked at Silas, who stood by the table, watching her, his face a landscape of emotions she was just beginning to learn how to read. Slowly, she lifted her hand. Her fingers went to the top button of her own dress, a small, polished bone button at her throat. She rested her fingers there, her touch light, and she paused. She looked at him, her gaze direct and clear. This was her question, her consent offered for his, her body, her choice. He understood. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. His eyes were dark with an emotion so profound it made her breath catch. The nod was his answer, his acceptance, his promise. "Only if you want." She took her hand away from the button and let it fall to her side, offering him the final gesture. He walked toward her, his boots silent on the wooden floor. He stopped before her, so close she could feel the warmth of his body, smell the scent of rain and clean earth that clung to him. He did not speak. He would not. This was a language beyond words. He lifted his good hand and, with a reverence that made her skin tingle, he touched the small button at her throat. His fingers were infinitely gentle as he worked it free from the buttonhole. One button. He paused, his eyes locked on hers, giving her another chance to stop him. She remained still, her breath held. He moved to the next button, and the next. With each small release, Lark felt something inside her let go. The first button was the shame of her arrival. The second, the fear of the riders on the hill. The third, the crushing weight of Alo's ghost. The fourth, the terror of the standoff. With each button, a year of fear, of servitude, of feeling worthless, was unfastened and allowed to fall away. He undid the last button at her waist and let his hands fall to his sides. He had not touched her skin. He had only touched the fabric that covered it. He had only taken what she had explicitly, silently offered. The firelight flickered across her skin, and she felt goosebumps rise. Not from the cold, but from the breathtaking feeling of being cherished, of being seen and respected in a way she had never dreamed possible. She reached out and rested her hands on his chest, feeling the solid beat of his heart. She leaned in and rested her forehead against his. His hand came up to rest on her upper back, a safe, supportive touch, his fingers warm against the thin cotton of her chemise. She wrapped her own arms around his neck, pulling him closer by a single, final inch, until there was no space left between them at all. They stood like that for a long time, breathing each other's air, two solitudes leaning together to become a fortress. On the chair by the fire, his old brown canvas coat lay where Wren had left it. It was a silent, faithful witness, the first thing he had ever given her, the garment that had shielded her from humiliation and had now become the keeper of the evidence that had set them free. Tomorrow, in Sagebrush Ferry, Barrett Voss would face the law. Preacher Boone would face his congregation. A corrupt system would be shaken to its foundations. But tonight, in the quiet of the Arrow and Cloud Ranch, Lark and Silas were completing their own, truer form of justice. The ultimate revenge was not in seeing their enemy jailed. It was in turning a cruel, vicious joke into the beginning of a home, in transforming a letter of lies into a story of love, in the quiet, safe, and consensual unfolding of two lives. Finally, truly, beginning. Here, in the warmth of the firelight, with the sound of the rain washing the world clean, they had found the final answer. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And to help this story reach more listeners, please support us by hitting the hype button. Your support means the world to us.